All right, hello and welcome everybody. Today I've got for you a review of Slaughterhouse Five by Kurt Vonnegut. This is one of those books that I've heard a lot about before I read it, and I never read it. I think this is my first book of Kurt Vonnegut's that I've ever read. And I mean, it's definitely a well-written book, right? It's, it's got good flow, it tells an interesting story. There was certainly no point where I was like, oh, I'm tired of this. I'm going to put this down. I probably could have read the whole thing in one sitting if I hadn't had other things that pressed into my time. So, so why do I feel so nonplussed about it after finishing it? Well, it's one of those books where I believe it sacrifices the message that it's trying to tell in more thoroughly. It sacrifices because generally speaking, you have to kind of sacrifice your message a little bit in order to you know create a story that is compelling and not merely preachiness, right? But like I think he goes further in sacrificing the message than he has to in this book, um, because well, I mean, let's get into it. So to start, Kurt Vonnegut, according to the book, was a prisoner of war who witnessed the firebombing of Dresden. Explicitly, this is said by Vonnegut in the first chapter, which is from Vonnegut's like first person POV. Um, it's an explicitly anti-war piece. It's especially against attacks on non-industrialized cities and their civilian populations. Right, the bombing of Dresden was, in fact, there's a part in this book where he's talking about Dresden and comparing it and contrasting it to Hiroshima in particular. And so he's quoting a someone he's calling Air Marshal Sondby, who says, "quote They would do well to read this book." And so Sondby is talking about his own book within the book. Basically, it's a quote within a quote within a quote kind of thing. So Sondby is talking about his book on bombings like this, and he says of his own book, they would do well to read this book, meaning Sondby's book, and ponder the fate of Dresden, where 135,000 people died as the result of an air attack with conventional weapons. Um, the atom bomb dropped on Hiroshima killed 71,379 people. Now, I went and I actually looked at the numbers, the statistics for this, and these numbers are not really up to what modern historians say the numbers are. I don't really have enough knowledge to go forth and address the studies that have made these numbers up. But the numbers that I just saw, looking it up online, was that Dresden was more in the range of 35 to 50,000 people, which is still same order of magnitude. But that Hiroshima, just counting the immediate deaths and acute radiation poisoning, people that died before the end of 1945, that number is 140,000. So, wherever he's getting these numbers, they are the opposite of what people think today who are working in this field. Which isn't to minimize either of these events, right? They're both tragic destructions of mostly civilian populations. Dresden, it's noted in Slaughterhouse Five, wasn't an industrial center, right? It was just a civilian population, mostly interested in making like non-military articles, basically. And certainly there's interesting stories to be made from the bombing of Dresden. You'd think, especially from someone who witnessed it as a POW. But the problem with Slaughterhouse Five is that instead of focusing on the bombing itself, what the book focuses on is the life of another character who was at the Dresden bombing by the name of Billy Pilgrim. And it's told in an extremely nonlinear style, which gives it artistic clout, right, as an interesting piece of writing. But at the same time, it kind of dilutes the horror of the Dresden bombing to get a sentence of it here, a sentence of it 30 pages later, a paragraph of it 40 pages after that. The justification for this nonlinear method of storytelling is that Billy himself has become unstuck in time, quote, unstuck in time. And what unfolds in the contents of the book is closer to fantasy than science fiction, really. Basically, Billy's perception or consciousness hops back and forth across history, across his own lifespan, at both appropriate and inappropriate times. The question that the reader is left to ask is his unstuckness in time a real thing, or is it like a manifestation of war trauma, and other brain trauma that he got later in life as well? The book doesn't provide a clear answer, right? And so, you're left to assume, well, if the author wanted it to have this message, then, Billy Pilgrim shouldn't be an unreliable narrator. But at the same time, there are some elements of Billy Pilgrim's, story that actually damage the anti-war message, at least on first glance. So, there is this POV character. There is a POV character who's Vonnegut himself, right? But he's only present in like a few paragraphs of the whole story. He's in the first chapter, and then after that, it's mostly kind of like a disconnected third-person perspective of this Billy Pilgrim character, not from Kurt Vonnegut himself's perspective, because he's not there, right? Other than the first chapter, Vonnegut's character appears only in a few paragraphs in the whole book, basically in Dresden itself. We don't have any outside confirmation that Pilgrim's pilgrimage through time and space and all that is actually real. It could, in fact, be the hallucination of someone who has been through serious war trauma, who's had serious brain injury, things like that. Moreover, the side plots that we get from the perspective of Pilgrim are often detrimental to the overall message, right? For instance, one of the points about Billy Pilgrim is that he gets abducted by aliens. They're called the Tralfamadorians. And the peculiar thing about them, and the thing that they also say is, the thing that they say is peculiar to mankind in particular, is our belief in something like free will. In fact, the Tralfamadorians say, and in the book they, what would you call it? Like, they credibly say that everything is already predetermined, that they already know what the end of the universe is going to be, and, everything is engineered, and they're not going to try to stop it, because they can't. Many people will see this notion of everything being predetermined as a betrayal of the anti-war message, because, if everything's predetermined, then there's nothing we can do about it. The book doesn't really help, because there's kind of this Tralfamadorian perspective on death throughout the whole book, right? If you are a being that lives outside of time and sees all time at the same time, sees all time simultaneously, then death is not really an end to anything. It's just a place where a line ends on something that you can see the entirety of. Similarly, if everything's predetermined, then what's the point of an anti-war message if there's nothing people can do to stop it, right? The Tralfamadorian message is to focus on the good times, but this advice is not particularly useful or rather, it's useful for everybody, right? In the sense that it could be used from the most downtrodden and beaten down prisoner to the most vile tyrant or mass murderer. Well, focus on the good times. It's not really helpful in any real sense, unless the goal of the story is to make us all think that time is irrelevant and everything's predetermined, which, I don't think anybody actually believes. At least not in the hard deterministic sense. Instead, what we're left to believe is that the book is anti-war because the artist said at the beginning of it that it's anti-war, and not because that message is consistent, even subtly but consistently present throughout the book. It didn't provide me, for instance, with any new perspectives or arguments, neither logical nor rhetorical, which seems to suggest to me that as a work that is explicitly designated as an anti-war work, that it's a failure. It hasn't told me anything that I can use to explain to people that why these things should be avoided, why these things should be minimized, eliminated, right? Instead, what we get is, well, they're just going to happen and there's not much you can do about it because there's nothing you can do about anything because everything's predetermined. It's a very mixed message, which, isn't the same thing as presenting a controversial or political message even-handedly, right? There is some of the even-handedness, right? It's talking about how, well, people in England were dying too from V1 and V2 bombs, stuff like that. That's all true. But and you can make a story, anti-war while talking about this and how, it would have been better if neither of these two, sets of bombs had to be detonated on these other populations, right? You can make that point, but if you say that there's nothing we can do about it, and so it goes, then you're not giving people who read the book any way to be to transfer what they've gotten out of the book into action for themselves, right? And so in that sense, it strikes me that it, as judged as a piece of anti-war literature, it's kind of a failure. It doesn't provide useful guidance. It doesn't provide a consistent message, and it doesn't even provide a consistent it doesn't do any significant handling of the opposing side either. There's a few sentences here and there. The whole contents of the book that are about the war part of the book about the Dresden bombing amount to a few paragraphs. There's a lot about being a prisoner of war, which of course is horrifying, and we expect it to be. That being said, as far as the writing itself goes, the book is imaginative. It's darkly whimsical. It flows well. It handles very disjointed narratives in an interesting and readable way. It's not confusing, despite the fact that you're constantly hopping from 1944 to 1965 to 1990 to 1925, whatever. I don't have the exact numbers in my head, but you're constantly hopping around, and you don't feel disjointed when this happens because because you're basically prepared for it, and then the book prepares you for it, and also does a good job of taking one point and flowing it into the next. One issue I would have with the writing is that Vonnegut has a tendency to very suddenly be extremely vulgar or extremely lurid or unsettlingly clinical. And these things are usually for just a moment. It's like a sentence, right? Where you're like, and that can be interesting if it's used to strong effect within the narrative, but in this case, they're kind of just there to shock you, and then you move on and they're gone. They aren't harnessed to support the message, not even as far as I can tell in some kind of subtle way. They just kind of shock you and then they pass. For instance, you could have some of this vulgar or lurid or clinical language to describe the aftermath of the bombing of Dresden, but generally speaking, the language there doesn't pop out as suddenly this way or suddenly the other way. It's just kind of part of the story, and that would have been a great place to do that, to shock the reader when you're talking about the aftermath of the bombing of Dresden. Instead, they're used at random points in the book that don't seem to have any correlation to, the story or the message or anything like that. I mean, the way that it handles the time travel, the story covers a fairly large portion of Billy Pilgrim's life. You have one sentence of him, before he's even born, but most of it is when he's kind of in his, 20s, in his 40s, in his 60s kind of thing. It covers these areas. It covers them pretty well. It manages to time hop between places. And the interesting thing about the way that it's covered is that there's often this subtle but not obvious, which I guess is what subtle means, connection between where the hop is starting and where the hop is ending. And so generally speaking, when you see one of these time hops happen, you say, oh, it's because, the back of your mind is it's because both of these moments had an element of blank, where blank is some kind of, adjective or feeling or something like that. It was a compelling read, right? Like I said earlier, it was one of those books that I could have easily sat down and read in one sitting. There was no point where I was bored. There was no point where, I said, oh, this is a good stopping point for today. I'm going to set it down and come back to it tomorrow. I've got stuff to do. It flows well, and it's, the prose is, compelling. It's well written for sure. There are some hints of like that kind of dark humor of like Dr. Strangelove in there. They were both written approximately in the 1960s. There's a lot of absurdity in the book. A lot of like looking at something and saying, "This look at how absurd this is." It has that dark humor, kind of satirical bite to it, without being too like sarcastic. Like you can get really sarcastic and like acerbic with this kind of stuff, but like it never feels that way. There's always a sense of genuineness to it, if that makes sense. It does, I said earlier that it's not really a science fiction story, and we'll get to that in just a second. It does contain one good sci-fi idea, which is these beings, the Tralfamadorians, that live outside of time and can see all of time at once, right? With that said, despite the fact that it does contain one good and interesting coverage of a neat sci-fi idea, I wouldn't call it a science fiction story. The science fiction ideas are not really integral to the story or the theme in that sense. Like I said, the Tralfamadorian perspective is often contrary to the anti-war perspective that the book says explicitly that it's trying to pass on to you. And in fact, the Tralfamadorian stuff isn't really integral to the operation of the world. We never know whether this is an actual thing that happened to Billy Pilgrim or whether this is the product of a deranged mind. Both of these things seem approximately equally probable. All of these alien stuff could have just been a hallucination, because Pilgrim, first off, Pilgrim was a POW and was traumatized in that way. He wasn't even doing that well during the war. And this is attributed to him kind of being unstuck in time and therefore not really there. But the way that it's written, you could take the unstuckness in time as just an excuse, that he's just somebody who always was a little bit out of it. And, being in war in horrible conditions just kind of popped him out entirely. And, he has to basically get dragged along by some people to be kept alive. Otherwise he would have simply collapsed in the snow and passed away. The book kind of points at the fact that everything is predetermined to say, well, he knows he's not going to die here, but like, again, it's one of those things where the book can say that everything is predetermined, but it doesn't. That's not an argument, right? It's just a statement that could be true or false depending on whether the Tralfamadorians are being honest with Billy Pilgrim when they speak to him about this topic. And the other thing that it lacks that science fiction generally needs to have. So the science fiction idea is not necessary to the story. It's not integral to the plot. It's not integral to the theme. It's not integral to the operation of the world. It could just be a hallucination, which is why I wouldn't call this a science fiction story. Also, there's no really consistent or significant vision of the future. There's like a 3-paragraph thing about Billy Pilgrim's rise to political power because of his ideas that he's handing out from Tralfamador, and then his assassination. Aside from the fact that there's an idea of like the United States breaking up into a balkanized state and the idea of ray guns, there's no real futurism there per se. This is one of those stories where it's literary, right? This is kind of like an early example and like a really good example of what all these magazines today that are looking for literary science fiction are looking for, in that the science fiction portion of it doesn't really have much to do with anything, but it is there, and it does, you can read it in such a way that it has something to do with everything, but if you're thoughtful about it, you're like, well, this could all just be, a crazy person, right? It is the product of a talented and imaginative writer. I'm not going to say Vonnegut is a bad writer. I'm just going to say that as far as telling a story that's supposed to have this anti-war point, he's kind of hedging it in such a way that it'd be very easy for people to miss, like or mistake parts of this anti-war message. I would say that if you are in agreement with that message, you won't find this book offensive in that sense. You'll at least say, yeah, he's trying to show some of the horrors of war, the horrors of being a POW, the horrors of the Dresden bombing. But like what you don't find in it is a philosophical reason to oppose war, which is kind of what you would hope to get from a book that is trying to be anti-war. So it goes.